A single fighter, one damaged runway, and 64 enemy aircraft closing in. On the morning of December 13th, 1943, the balance over northeast India was hanging on a pilot who didn't yet know that, in a few minutes, he would be alone between a Japanese strike force and the destruction of an airfield. At 9:27 hours, 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair eased his Curtiss P-40 Newton's Warhawk into a climbing turn above Assam, India. Below him lay Dinjan airfield. Ahead, through the thin morning haze 3 miles to the east, shapes began to resolve out of the sky, row after row of aircraft, 64 in all, advancing straight toward his base. Adair was 23 years old. He had already flown 43 combat sorties with the 89th Fighter Squadron, escorting and protecting the vital Hump airlift into China. But today, at the crucial moment, he was the only fighter already in the air when the Japanese formation appeared. The stakes were not theoretical. Over the previous 8 weeks, coordinated Japanese raids had smashed Allied airfields across northeast India. 47 transport aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. 112 men had been killed before they could even take off. On days like this, surprise on the ground meant catastrophe. His P-40, tail number 44, carried the personal name Lulu Belle. It was a rugged, workmanlike fighter. 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, with enough ammunition for roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire. Not much when measured against dozens of enemy aircraft. The attacking formation was built for damage. 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers flew in the center, escorted by approximately 40 Nakajima Ki, 43 Oscar fighters layered above and below them, a moving cage of protection around the bombers. Intelligence reports had warned that raids of this size in Burma had achieved up to 90% hit rates against airfields that lacked fighter opposition. Unchecked, this incoming wave could do the same. On the ground at Dinjan, the potential target set was obvious. 14 C-47 transports were parked and loaded with essential supplies for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China. A field hospital was treating 63 wounded soldiers. Fuel dumps held enough aviation fuel to keep the Hump route running for 11 more days. If the bombers reached the airfield without serious interference, the resulting destruction could cripple Allied airlift operations for weeks. Help was far away. The closest friendly fighters were at Jorhat, 38 minutes flying time from Dinjan. They would not arrive before the bombs. In the cockpit, Adair checked his own situation. Internal tanks were full, 180 gallons of fuel, giving him roughly 90 minutes of endurance at combat power. The Japanese formation was about 3,000 feet below his position, advancing at 240 miles per hour toward the airfield. Standard doctrine was clear. A fighter pilot outnumbered by more than 5 to 1 was expected to hold off, call for support, and wait for reinforcements. Adair was facing odds closer to 64 to 1. He could radio for help, shadow the bombers from a distance, and hope that backup might arrive in time, though it almost certainly would not. Or he could attack alone and try to break the formation before it reached its bombing run. He advanced the throttle instead. The Allison V1710 engine in Lulu Belle responded immediately. Manifold pressure climbed to 54 inches. The Warhawk picked up speed, 280, 300, then 320 miles per hour. Adair maneuvered into the classic position for a deflection attack. He slid around to the south and climbed until he sat roughly 4,000 feet above the bombers, the sun at his back, making his approach that much harder to see. Below, the Ki-43 escorts were still focused ahead, toward the target. No one seemed to be scanning the high rear quadrant. For a moment, Adair had one advantage that no amount of numbers could erase: surprise. The Japanese crews expected to encounter fighters as they neared the target, perhaps over the field itself, perhaps just before the bomb run. They did not expect a solitary P-40 to be waiting 20 miles out, already above them. Adair set his plan quickly. He would strike at the lead bomber element first, ignore the fighters initially, and go straight for the heart of the formation. If he could shatter their bombing pattern, force them to scatter, anything that degraded their accuracy might save the airfield. 1 P-40, 64 enemy aircraft, and a question: could a single Warhawk really disrupt an entire raid? If you want to see how this plays out, hit like, subscribe for more combat history, and then we'll go straight back to Adair as he dives in. The lead Ki-21 group held a tight, disciplined pattern. 6 bombers, 2 neat V-shapes of 3 aircraft each, flying wingtip to wingtip. Adair rolled his P-40 inverted, pulled the nose down, and began a steep diving attack from their 7 o'clock high position behind and above, where their defensive guns were weakest. His airspeed built rapidly in the dive. 340 miles per hour. 360. The Allison engine was at full power, the frame shuddering slightly from the strain. The range to the bombers closed quickly. In the cockpits of the Sallies, no one had yet spotted the dark shape knifing down through the sky behind them. At around 800 yards, Adair squeezed the trigger. The 6 .50 caliber guns opened up together, the P-40 vibrating under the recoil. Streams of tracer rounds arced into the formation. His fire walked up the left wing of the lead bomber. Fabric ripped away, sparks flashed from metal structure. A moment later, the bomber's port engine erupted into orange flame. Black smoke streamed out and washed across the bomber's tail. The effect on the formation was immediate. The carefully dressed V disintegrated as pilots instinctively broke away, some left, some right, some climbing, others diving. The tight geometry required for accurate bombing vanished in a burst of evasive action. Adair hauled back on the stick, pulling roughly 7 Gs as he rocketed through the disrupted formation and climbed away, rolling right to reposition. Above and behind him, the fighter cover reacted. Roughly 40 Oscars were now diving toward him. The Ki-43 was among the most agile fighters in the Pacific War, powered by a Nakajima Ha 115 engine that produced around 1,150 horsepower. An Oscar could reach about 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, and could outturn any American fighter in theater. Its distinctive butterfly flaps allowed Japanese pilots to snap into extremely tight turns without stalling, shedding speed to cut inside opponents who tried to circle with them. Over the previous 6 months, Oscars had claimed 63 Allied fighters over Burma and Northeast India. They were proven killers in the right hands. Adair's P-40 Newtons had its own strengths, a more powerful Allison V171081 engine, producing roughly 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute, and a top speed around 378 miles per hour at altitudes below 12,000 feet. In a straight-line dash or a diving attack, the Warhawk had the edge. But in a sustained turning battle, the heavier American fighter would bleed energy far faster than the light Japanese interceptors. Tactics for P-40 pilots fighting Oscars were drilled in blunt terms. Never try to turn with them. Use speed. Make high-speed slashing attacks, then extend away. Climb back, reset, and strike again. Boom and zoom never dogfight. But today, extending away meant leaving the bombers free to reform. If Adair broke off and ran, the Sallies would recover their tight V formations and continue toward Dinjan. He could save himself and still lose the airfield. He elected to stay engaged, even if it meant facing 40 fighters largely on his own. The first 4 Oscars came in from his 10 o'clock high position, spread in a loose finger 4 formation. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up to meet them, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. His tracers ripped through empty sky just over the Oscar's canopy. The Japanese pilot broke hard right, and his wingman followed. Adair immediately reversed his turn, rolling through and diving away to preserve his speed. 2 more Oscars dropped in from above. Spotting them at around 400 yards, he pitched into a climbing left turn and fired again, still no hits. In the corner of his vision, his ammunition counters ticked down, roughly 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. At his current rate of fire, he had about 6 serious attack runs left. Behind the fighter screen, the bombers were trying to salvage their mission. 3 groups of 6 Ki-21 seconds each were edging back into some semblance of order, compressing the chaos into new V formations. If they managed to reform their bombing geometry, they would press onward and drop. Adair estimated he had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Dinjan. He leveled out, shoved the throttle fully forward again, and dove toward the bombers a second time. This time, 8 Oscars dropped in behind him, attempting to follow his dive. The P-40, heavier and faster, surged ahead 390, then 405 miles per hour. The fighters couldn't quite match his pace in the dive, and the gap opened. Adair pulled out at bomber altitude, lined himself up on the right-hand Sally element, and closed in. Range, 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The radial Mitsubishi Ha-101 exploded into a bright fireball. The bomber rolled sharply to the right, shedding debris and flame. Its wingman yanked away to avoid colliding with the burning aircraft. Adair kicked in rudder, slid left across the bomber stream, and triggered another burst at a second sally. This time, his rounds punched straight through the thin fuselage skin. The Ki-21 had been designed in the mid-1930 seconds, and it showed. There was no armor plate for the crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks. What it did have was bomb capacity over 2,200 pounds of ordnance, enough to tear Dinjan's parked transports, hospital, and fuel stocks to pieces if delivered in a concentrated pattern. The fighter escort was closing again, 12 Oscars now converging on his position. Adair took a quick inventory. Fuel, approximately 162 gallons remaining. Ammunition, around 650 rounds. The bombers were 19 miles from Dinjan, perhaps 4 minutes from their ideal drop point. Then the engine temperature began to climb. The Allison V171081 was a liquid-cooled inline engine. Coolant circulated through passages in the cylinder heads and block, absorbing heat, and then flowed through a radiator mounted in a scoop beneath the fuselage. At high power settings above 50 inches of manifold pressure, the engine produced tremendous heat, and the cooling system was designed to sustain that load for only about 20 minutes. Adair had been running at or near full combat power for 11 minutes. His coolant temperature gauge crept up past 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal was around 210. At 250, the risk of serious engine damage, even outright failure, became very real. He had to choose: reduce power and let the engine cool, but give the bombers room to reform, break off entirely, and turn for home, hoping that ground crews would survive the raid. Or hold power, keep attacking, and risk losing the engine while still over contested territory. The Sally formation was still within practical bombing range, about 17 miles from Dinjan and turning slowly toward their original axis. The threat remained. Adair kept the throttle forward. 2 Oscars came straight at him head-on. The combined closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. Both Japanese pilots opened fire at roughly 500 yards, thin streams of 7.7 millimeters tracers reaching out toward his nose. Adair fired back. His .50 caliber rounds were heavier, carried far more energy, and retained it better over distance. At about 350 yards, his fire struck the left-hand Oscar's engine cowling. The lightweight fighter jolted, then broke away, trailing a white vapor plume coolant. Its wingman followed it out of the line of fire. Adair rolled right and dropped into another dive. His coolant temperature edged up to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The bombers were now about 15 miles from the target. 2 of the 3 6-plane bomber groups had reformed into proper V formations again. The third remained scattered, 3 Ki-21 seconds struggling to regain position. He committed to another strike on the lead element. 6 Oscars tried to cut him off, but he dove through them at roughly 390 miles per hour, too fast for them to pull enough lead. At bomber altitude, he leveled, centered the lead Sally in his gun sight, and fired a long burst. The first rounds struck the bomber at the right wing root. The structural loads were already high. Under the stress of fire and aerodynamic force, the outer wing panel failed, snapping upward and tearing away from the aircraft. The Ki-21 rolled inverted and dropped into an unrecoverable spin. No parachutes appeared. The crew went down with the aircraft. Once again, the bomber formation fractured. Aircraft scattered left, right, and down, breaking course in 3 different directions. Their tight bombing geometry was gone. Even if they released bombs now, the pattern would be spread over miles of jungle instead of focused on the airfield. Adair pulled his P-40 up hard. The coolant temperature gauge read 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The Allison was running rough. He could feel new vibrations through the control stick. Inside the cylinders, detonation and pre-ignition were beginning fuel igniting too early under extreme heat. If he did not reduce power soon, the engine would simply seize. 8 Oscars fell on him from above. He caught sight of them late, rolled left, but not quickly enough. 7.7 millimeters rounds punched into his right wing. Fabric peeled back. Metal ribs buckled. One round tore through the control rod for his right aileron. Suddenly, roll response on that side turned mushy. He had to haul harder on the stick just to keep the wings level. Another burst walked up the fuselage. Rounds sparked against the engine cowling. One penetrated the firewall area and smashed into the coolant reservoir. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The temperature needle surged past 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam vented from gaps in the cowling. At the same time, his oil pressure gauge began to drop. The Allison was dying. Adair pulled the throttle back sharply. Engine RPM fell from around 3,000 to 2,400. That reduction took some strain off the engine, but also robbed the P-40 of lift-generating speed. The aircraft began to sink 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. Above him, the Oscars stopped pressing close attacks. They began circling, watching, waiting for the inevitable mechanical failure. Then the engine caught fire. In a liquid-cooled fighter, engine fires follow a chillingly predictable pattern. First, overheated coolant vaporizes and ignites. Flames then stream back along the cowling, pulled by the slipstream. If the fire reaches exposed fuel lines along the side of the engine, the result is usually an explosion. Adair probably had 30 seconds before Lulu Belle turned into a fireball. Standard procedure was immediate. Cut the engine, bail out. But he was at only around 8,000 feet, dropping fast, and still 12 miles from the safety of friendly lines. The jungle below was known to harbor Japanese patrols. Bailing out here could mean capture or worse. He chose to fight the fire and keep flying. The Allison's fuel mixture could be adjusted manually. Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for roughly 3 seconds, starving the engine of fresh fuel. The flames weakened, their intensity dropping as combustible vapor decreased. He then eased the mixture control forward again. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally caught once more, running very rough, delivering perhaps 60% of its usual power. Not enough to climb, barely enough to hold altitude. He was now committed. Either ride this burning, wounded aircraft back toward friendly territory, or abandon it over hostile jungle. Behind him, the raid was breaking apart. The Sally bombers were about 13 miles from Dinjan, but their formations were gone. Individual bombers were already turning southeast, back toward Burma. The escorts were following them out. The attack on Dinjan airfield had been stopped in the air. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest, away from the broken Japanese raid and toward his own lines. His new objective was simple and unforgiving: get Lulu Belle back to base before the engine quit for good. Nguli airfield lay roughly 43 miles away. At his current speed, that meant around 15 minutes of flying if the Allison engine held together. 6 Oscars slid in behind him, keeping their distance, shadowing him like vultures tracking a wounded animal. At about 7,000 feet, his oil pressure gauge dropped to 0. The Allison engine relied on pressurized oil to lubricate the crankshaft, connecting rods, and camshaft. Without that film of oil, metal began to grind directly against metal. Friction built heat. Heat warped components. Sooner or later, something inside would seize. Vibration through the airframe increased. His forward speed bled away down toward 180 miles per hour, closing uncomfortably on the P-40's stall speed of around 120. Behind him, the Oscars drifted closer, stopping at about 400 yards. They still didn't fire. They were waiting for the inevitable, the moment the engine locked and the American pilot had to bail out or crash. One of the Japanese fighters eased up alongside him, close enough that Adair could make out the other pilot's features. The Oscars pilot pointed down toward the jungle, an unmistakable gesture. Land. Surrender. Give up. Adair stared straight ahead and ignored him. At 6,000 feet, new smoke began leaking into the cockpit, not from the burning engine, but from behind the instrument panel. Some of the rounds that had hit the fuselage had torn through control lines and electrical wiring. The insulation was smoldering, feeding hot, acrid smoke into the confined cockpit. His eyes and throat burned. He slid the canopy back. The rush of wind carried some of the smoke away, but the open canopy made breathing a struggle at high speed. His airspeed sagged further, to around 160 miles per hour. Above and behind him, the Oscars slowly widened their circle. From their perspective, the fight was over. The damaged American fighter was sinking, its engine failing. There was no reason to waste ammunition on an aircraft that would soon slam into the jungle on its own. They waited and watched. At around 4,000 feet, the situation suddenly worsened. The already damaged right aileron control cable finally failed. With that cable severed, the aileron on the right wing dropped to full deflection and stayed there. The P-40 rolled hard to the right, nose pitching down into a steeper and steeper dive. Adair hauled back on the stick with both hands. Nothing. The elevator cables had also been damaged. The tailplane was effectively stuck in a nose-down attitude. The aircraft refused to respond. The altimeter unwound quickly. Airspeed climbed 200 miles per hour, 220, 240. The jungle canopy rushed up at him. Altitude, 3,000 feet. 2,500. 2,000. Impact, at that rate, would be fatal. Then a different kind of calculation cut through the chaos. Aerodynamics worked the same no matter which way up the aircraft was. Right side up, the damaged right aileron was forcing that wing down. The stuck elevator trim was pushing the nose down as well, feeding the dive. But inverted, the same damage would have the opposite effect. Upside down, the right wing would be forced up instead of down. The elevator, frozen in a nose-down setting, would effectively push the tail down and the nose up. The very damage dragging him into the jungle might, if he reversed everything, help pull him away from it. At roughly 1,800 feet above the trees, Adair rolled Lulu Belle fully inverted. -G pressed him up against his harness. Blood surged into his head. His vision tinted red at the edges. The fuel system, designed to feed properly under positive G loads, struggled. The engine coughed, sputtered, nearly died, then caught again, still running roughly but providing precious thrust. And the nose came up. The descent rate eased. The P-40's fall slowed and then stabilized. At about 1,200 feet, still inverted, Lulu Belle was flying more or less level at roughly 140 miles per hour. Adair held this attitude for around 40 seconds. Airspeed crept up to 160. The aircraft even began to gain altitude, climbing slowly, maybe 50 feet per minute. It wasn't much, but it was the difference between certain impact and a narrow margin of survival. Then the fuel starvation problem returned. The engine faltered. Inverted flight was starving the fuel feed. Adair rolled the aircraft upright. Immediately, the damage controls reasserted themselves. The nose dropped again. The P-40 slipped back into a downward flight path, sinking at about 600 feet per minute. He waited until he had lost roughly 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. The climb resumed. Inverted to gain height, upright to keep the fuel flowing properly. Flip to climb, flip to descend. Over and over, he rode this unnatural pattern, fighting both the aircraft and his own fading strength. High above, the 6 Oscars watched this almost unbelievable sight, a shot-up American P-40 with a burning, oil-starved engine and damaged controls, flying a bizarre alternating pattern upside down, then right side up, again and again, refusing to crash, clawing for altitude in small, stubborn increments. One Oscar dove closer, as if to confirm that this was real. Seeing him come, Adair rolled inverted to buy a little more altitude, then snapped back to upright, aiming the nose roughly toward the Japanese fighter. The Oscar pilot broke away sharply. Insane. Desperate. Either way, the Japanese pilots decided they had seen enough. One by one, the Oscars turned east and disappeared toward Burma. Adair was alone again. He kept working the rolling pattern. Fuel quantity showed around 83 gallons remaining. Oil pressure still read 0. The needle had been pinned there for 9 minutes. By all normal mechanical logic, the engine should have seized. Yet somehow, it kept running, held together by momentum, friction, and whatever microscopic film of oil still clung to its internal surfaces. Altitude slowly crept up 3,000 feet, then 4,000. Naguli Airfield lay roughly 21 miles to the southwest, no more than 11 minutes away if he could maintain his current speed. His coolant temperature gauge had failed completely. Somewhere along the line, the needle had actually melted off. Smoke still trailed from the cowling, but the flames had diminished. Either the fire had burned itself out, or the destruction of the coolant system had starved it of fuel. At about 5,000 feet, Adair finally spotted Naguli. Runway, control tower, the revetment's home, and relative safety. A new problem immediately presented itself. The P-40's main landing gear was hydraulically operated. Hydraulic pressure came from a pump driven by the engine. With the Allison barely producing power, the pump was generating almost no pressure. If he lowered the gear and the engine died, he risked crashing short of the runway and breaking apart on the approach. If he left the gear up and attempted a belly landing, the damage might rupture surviving fuel tanks and turn the aircraft into a rolling fireball. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine quit. He also needed to be close enough to the runway that, if the engine failed completely, he could still glide to it. He reached for the gear handle. His right hand was trembling not from fear, but from carbon monoxide building up in his bloodstream. For nearly a quarter of an hour, he had been breathing a cocktail of smoke and CO in the cockpit. He pulled the gear lever down. Nothing happened. Under normal conditions, the P-40's hydraulic system operated around 1,000 pounds per square inch. Engine-driven hydraulic fluid extended and retracted the landing gear through steel lines and actuators. With the engine providing minimal power, the pump simply could not build enough pressure. The gear stayed firmly retracted. There was a manual backup, a hand-operated hydraulic pump mounted on the left side of the cockpit. According to the manual, 28 vigorous strokes would supply enough pressure to push the gear down and lock it. Adair grabbed the pump handle with his left hand, his right still on the stick. He worked the pump. 1, 2, 3, nothing. The gear remained up. To get the required pressure, the hand pump really needed both hands, but letting go of the control stick with a fighter that barely flew straight on its own meant almost certainly losing control. The damaged ailerons and elevator were constantly trying to pull the nose out of line and drag one wing down. He improvised. Reaching behind him, Adair unfastened his lap belt, wrapped it around the control stick, and then through part of the seat frame. He pulled the strap tight. The rigged belt held the stick roughly near center imperfect, but enough to keep Lulu Belle flying approximately straight and level. Freed, he seized the hand pump with both hands and heaved. 5 strokes. 10. 15. Around the 23rd stroke, he felt resistance build in the handle. Hydraulic pressure was rising. At the 28th stroke, a solid thump echoed from beneath the cockpit. The left main landing gear extended and locked into place. 3 seconds later, the right main gear followed, clunking into the down and locked position. Drag instantly increased. Gear down configuration turned the P-40 into a much draggier aircraft. His airspeed bled off further from about 160 to roughly 135 miles per hour, still above stall, but not by much. Naguli's runway was now about 7 miles ahead, maybe 3 minutes, if nothing else failed. His vision had narrowed to a gray-edge tunnel. Carbon monoxide was degrading his brain function, slow and insidious. He forced himself to focus on the runway. 6 miles. 5. One of the remaining temperature gauges, still functioning, read 310 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond the engine's indicated limit. Internal components were expanding. Clearances were closing. Somewhere in the mass of fast-moving parts, a piston, a valve, or a connecting rod was nearing the point of failure. 4 miles. In the tower at Naguli, controllers spotted him, a P-40 trailing smoke, weaving slightly in the approach, gear already down. To them, it looked like a damaged but controllable fighter returning from mission. They assumed he would fly a standard pattern, reduce power, lower flaps, slow to approach speed, and touch down gently on the main wheels. But Adair had one more systems problem. The flaps were hydraulic as well. With what little power the engine had left, there was not enough reserve to pump pressure for both gear and flaps. He had chosen gear. The flaps remained fully up. A flapless landing in a P-40 meant a much higher approach speed, closer to 120 miles per hour instead of the gentler 90. That, in turn, meant a longer landing roll on the order of 3,000 feet for a damaged, heavy aircraft on a 4,000-foot runway. It was possible, but it demanded precision and, most importantly, enough airspeed and control to execute properly. At about 2 miles from the runway, the inevitable happened. The engine stopped. The propeller, no longer driven, began to windmill, then slowed. The last trace of power vanished. The Warhawk became a glider, a poor one. The P-40's glide ratio was roughly 8, 1 inch clean condition. From 2,000 feet of altitude, a pilot could expect to glide about 3 miles. The runway was 2 miles away. In theory, with everything working and drag minimized, he might just make it. But Lulu Belle was not a clean aircraft anymore. Bullet holes, torn fabric, bent surfaces, and extended landing gear all increased drag. Realistically, his glide ratio was closer to 6-to-1 or worse. On that glide path, he was short. He would come down in the trees before the runway. After fighting off 64 enemy aircraft, after flying inverted to stay airborne, after nursing a dying engine for 15 minutes, it looked as if he would crash only a few hundred yards from safety. Then another fragment of training surfaced in his mind, something half-remembered from lectures on glide performance and the peculiarities of the P-40. In a normal glide, flying upright, the aircraft descends nose first. Lift generated by the wing balances some of the weight, while drag and gravity pull it downward along a predictable path. Inverted, wing camber and lift behavior reverse. Under certain angles of attack, the inverted configuration can actually produce less drag for a given glide speed. It was an odd theoretical point in classroom discussions. No one had expected a pilot to use it in combat. But Adair had run out of conventional options. At roughly 1,800 feet of altitude, about 1 mile from the runway, he rolled Lulu Belle inverted again, this time in a dead-stick glide, gear still extended. Blood once more rushed to his head. His vision pulsed red. The jungle and runway now hung above him from his inverted perspective. He held the attitude and watched the instruments. Airspeed stabilized around 125 miles per hour. The descent rate settled at about 500 feet per minute, better than the 700 feet per minute he had been seeing upright. The inverted glide was actually stretching his remaining distance. In the tower, and out on the field, men stared. They saw a P-40 coming in upside down, landing gear down, trailing smoke. Aerodynamically, it was all wrong. Structurally, the gear was never meant to take air loads from that angle. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, a crew chief, raised binoculars and tracked the incoming fighter. The silhouette was American, but the behavior made no sense. A thought flashed across his mind. Perhaps a Japanese pilot had captured a P-40 and was attempting some kind of attack run on the field. Martinez sprinted toward the nearest 50 caliber gun position, shouting. 3 ground crewmen joined him. They traversed the weapon, bringing the upside-down fighter into their sights. Out on approach? Adair was at roughly 400 feet and half a mile from the runway threshold, still inverted. His consciousness was fading. Carbon monoxide and prolonged negative G were draining his ability to think. He had perhaps 20 seconds of clear awareness left. He had to time the final roll perfectly. If he rolled upright too early, the damage controls would drag the nose down, and he might slam into the ground short of the concrete. If he waited too long, he would overshoot the runway or touch down with too little room to stop. At an estimated 200 feet of altitude, about 300 yards from the threshold, Adair rolled Lulu Belle upright for the last time. The moment he came level, the damaged right aileron tried to pull the wing down again. He fought it with heavy left stick, forcing the wings roughly level. The crippled elevator gave only partial response. The nose wanted to drop. He pulled harder. The Warhawk came in nose high, sinking fast, wings twitching, barely under control. From Martinez's gun pit, the P-40 filled the sight picture. Smoke, damage, erratic flight. In 3 seconds, it would cross the threshold. Friendly or enemy, he had to decide. He held fire. Adair crossed the runway threshold at about 90 feet, descending steeply. There was no time for finesse. In roughly 4 seconds, the aircraft dropped the last of its height and slammed onto the concrete. The main gear struck first. A brutal impact somewhere around 7 Gs. The struts compressed to their limits. The tail wheel crashed down. Metal shrieked in protest. A moment later, the right main gear leg failed under the load. The right wing dropped, the wingtip hit the runway, and dug in. The P-40 ground-looped violently to the right, swinging in a half circle, throwing sparks and fragments of concrete. It skidded backward for about 200 feet and finally shuddered to a stop. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. Fire trucks and crash crews were already moving. For 12 long seconds, Adair didn't move. Then he unlocked his harness, forced himself up, and climbed out onto the wing. His legs buckled when his boots touched the metal, but he grabbed the wing root and stayed upright long enough for ground crew to reach him and help him down. Martinez arrived with the fire crew and ordered the cowling open. Inside, the Allison engine was a wreck. Pistons were seized in their cylinders. The crankshaft showed visible warping. The oil pan was cracked. Coolant and oil remnants splattered across the compartment. The cooling system was shredded. Adair and Martinez walked slowly around the aircraft, taking stock. They counted 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, 4 in the left. One round had completely severed the right aileron control cable. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had ripped through 2 electrical bundles behind the instrument panel. The engine, examined in detail afterward, showed catastrophic damage from overheating and oil starvation. Cylinder walls scored, 3 connecting rods fused to the crankshaft, coolant system destroyed beyond salvage. Lulu Belle would never fly again. But Dinjan airfield was intact. Intelligence assessments after the raid confirmed it. All 24 Ki-21 Sally bombers had turned away without releasing their bombs. The formation had broken apart roughly 15 miles short of its target. 40 Ki-43 Oscars had escorted empty bombers back to Burma. No bombs fell on Allied installations that day. No personnel were killed or injured on the ground. All 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift continued without a pause. On December 16th, 1943, 3 days after the mission 10th, Air Force staff officers interviewed Adair in detail. He walked them through the attack runs, the inverted flying with damaged controls, the desperate landing approach. Flight surgeons also examined him. Laboratory tests showed elevated carbon monoxide levels in his blood even 72 hours after the mission. Their conclusion was stark. For the final 11 minutes of flight, Adair had been operating under severe CO poisoning at a level that should have rendered him unconscious. Sheer will and focus had kept him functioning in the cockpit. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commanding U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, presented Second Lieutenant Philip Adair with the Silver Star. The citation recorded that, on December 13, 1943, he had alone attacked and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft closing on Allied facilities, continuing his assaults despite serious damage to his aircraft and personal danger, and thereby preventing the destruction of vital supply assets. Adair would go on to fly 95 more combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group. He became an ace, credited with 5 confirmed aerial victories. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 3 decades, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, continued combat operations until August 1945. By the end of the war, their pilots had destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in the air and 147 more on the ground. 63 of their own pilots were killed or went missing. Their skull insignia, painted on P-40 cowlings, became one of the most recognizable emblems in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never enjoyed the legend of later American fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower, particularly at altitude, and by 1943 many considered it obsolete. It lacked glamorous statistics and cutting-edge performance. But in the hands of pilots like Philip Adair, it proved something that mattered more than top speed or ceiling. What counted in combat was not the brochure specifications, but the resolve and skill of the person in the cockpit. One pilot, one supposedly outdated fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. On December 13th, 1943, Philip Adair showed that impossible odds is just a phrase until someone refuses to accept it. His solution to shattered controls flying alternately inverted and upright for 11 minutes broke every conventional rule of piloting. His inverted approach with gear extended was a maneuver that had never been attempted before and, as far as records show, has never been duplicated since. That was the day a single P-40 from the Burma Banshees broke an entire Japanese raid and kept an airfield alive. If stories like this remind you why we hold on to history, consider hitting like, subscribing for more accounts of overlooked warriors, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Share in the comments where you're watching from and if anyone in your family served in the CBI theater or flew the old Warhawk.